just a few moments, Brother Evan Caraway will open us in a word of prayer. We do have just a few remaining copies of the lesson. If you want to grab that, that'll also contain the remainder of the lessons for us. Brother Evan.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this another beautiful day that you've blessed us with. We thank you for this opportunity we've had now to come together and to study from your word and to learn more about you. Pray that you be with Colby as he leads us in our study. Help us to pay attention and apply these things to our life. Pray that you be with those that are not able to be with us this morning. Help them to be back quickly. Please keep us safe and be with us always. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
It's hard to believe that the first quarter is almost already done, but we are drawing to a close here in our study, or the first quarter of the study of Jesus, the Bread of Life. Again, the course of our study for these next 2 weeks, I will be with you. The fifth Sunday of this month, I will be in Decatur at Danville Road in a gospel meeting. So Brother Matt Oglesby will finish out the quarter, and then he will also take up the mantle in the second quarter into the second section of Jesus' ministry. Now, prior to getting into where we are this morning, I do think, because we've had a couple of weeks between classes, let's try to review where we have been. So we've made it now to the beginning of Jesus' Galilean ministry. We talked about that in Luke chapter 4. And remember, why did Jesus go to Galilee? What was the major thing that drove him from Judea to Galilee? What happened? All right, John the Baptist was arrested, and ultimately he's going to be killed, and that drives Jesus from Judea up to Galilee. And of course, when he makes his way to that Sea of Galilee, the central hub of his earthly ministry is going to be what city? Capernaum. And that's going to be the city that's going to have probably the most per capita of his miracles and different things like that. You had the calling of the 4 fishermen. You had Peter, Andrew, James, and John, all called there in Luke chapter 5. You had the cleansing of the leper in Mark chapter 1. We covered that. We had the healing of the paralytic. The last study we were in, we were looking at that in Mark chapter 2 and verses 1 through 12. The call of Matthew. Matthew was a what? A tax collector. Jesus calls the tax collector, and again, when Jesus calls Matthew, Matthew throws a feast at his house that evening. The Pharisees and the others see that, and what do they begin to squabble about with Jesus? Yeah, why are you eating with these publicans and sinners? Why are you engaging them? And then Jesus also gives us the various things there about the new wine and the old wine skins and all of those figures and metaphors that he used there. So today we look at the controversy at Bethesda. Now in John chapter 5, it tells us that this is a feast. Now what is unique here is it doesn't tell us what feast it was. Now if it is a Passover feast, I would tend to believe, because this is John's way in which he writes, John would indicate that to us, as he did back in John chapter 2, as he will again in John chapter 6, and then finally in John chapters 12 and following. John emphasizes the Passover feast. So is this a Passover feast? It's very likely it could be, and it's also very likely it could be another of the feasts. Now John does include some other feasts in his gospel. He includes the Feast of the Tabernacles and Booths, which is John chapter 7, verse 1, all the way chapter 10, verse 21. And then beginning in John chapter 10 and verse 22, you have the Feast of Dedication, or what we would know today in the 21st century as the Hanukkah feast, is in John chapter 10 and verse 22 down through the remainder of that chapter. But what John chapter 5 begins is the cycle of feast in the Gospel of John. So it begins with a feast here in John chapter 5, and it's going to end with a feast in John chapter 10 with the Feast of Dedication. Well, why were the Jews so angry at Jesus for healing the man at the pool of Bethesda? because it was the Sabbath. And so as we march through the text, as you think about everything that transpires here, so Jesus makes his arrival into Jerusalem. It is around one of the feasts, whatever that feast may be. The inclusion of the end of verse 3 and verse 4 has just always been something that's kind of interesting to me. You could do a deep dive in that and where those where that may have come from, where the origins of that. Is that, John writing that, or is that a scribal addition? I don't think it changes anything in the story. It doesn't change anything in the narrative at all. But here, a man who has been ill for how long? 38 years. He's laid himself beside this pool of water. And what I've read is, so you note that earlier in this, it tells us that there's a pool and there's 5 porticos. And really, there's 2 pools of water here at the pool of Bethesda. There was one pool of water that was the gathering pool. That's essentially where all the rainwater and the different waters, because remember, Jerusalem's built up on a mountain, so you would need to collect water to be able to have water. Well, that was the upper pool, and then when the upper pool would get, or the lower pool would get low, they would release the water and it would come down from the upper pool down into the lower pool. That's also a suspect of why the waters moved, as he says here. I'm waiting on the waters to move. It's not necessarily that there's an angelic being that would come down and grace the waters, but rather that they would open the floodgates of the upper pool, and then that water would come down into the lower pool to refill it, and believe that that was some supernatural thing, not just a natural occurrence that's happening. So he's been lying there for 38 years. Jesus comes and asks him what? Do you want to be healed? This miracle in John chapter 5 is unique in my opinion. It's very different than others. Well, first, because Jesus goes to this particular man. And then when he goes to this particular man, does this man know anything about Jesus? He doesn't recognize him, and apparently he has not heard anything about him. And that really sets this miracle off to its side versus so many of the others. I mean, when the woman with the hemorrhage, why did she go up and grasp the fringe of his garment? Because she had what? She had heard about him. Why did Zacchaeus go up into the sycamore tree? Because he had heard about him. Why did the leper come up to Jesus and say, Lord, if you are willing? Because he had heard about him. But here, this man has been lying here. It appears that there's nothing on him in the sense that he knows anything about who Jesus is. Well, Jesus tells him to arise, pick up your pallet, and walk. And that's when the Pharisees nab him, right? And why do they get on to him? What has he done when he picks up his bed and walks? He's working, or that he's violated the Sabbath. So what you have here, and this is a great instance of it, and Matthew chapter 12 is going to be another instance of this, is what the Jews had done, particularly during the intertestamental periods, is they had organized themselves into these human traditions that were safeguards against breaking the law. Now you go back to the origins of the Sabbath. You go all the way back to Genesis 2, Exodus 16, and then to the commandment itself in Exodus chapter 20 and verses 8 through 11. The overarching general statement is that on the Sabbath it is to be kept holy, and there is not to be any what done on the Sabbath? Any work done. But then, well, what particular work is not to be done? Well, if you drop down to Exodus 31, and I know I'm just giving you these cross-references, but I think it's good for you to know these things. In Exodus 31 and verses 13 through 17, there's a little bit more of a lengthy and a little bit more explanation of what is not allowed on the Sabbath day. Some various things that is not allowed. You're not to kindle a fire for cooking. You're not to gather fuel. You're not to carry burdens. You're not to transact business on the Sabbath day. But here in John chapter 5, we really get into the gray areas that the human tradition, the Jewish thought had really brought into this. So the Jews had allowed themselves to walk 200 cubits. I believe it's what it is. 200 cubits was what they were allowed to walk, and that's based upon Joshua chapter 3. So they said, okay, you can walk this many steps on the Sabbath day, but if you can't walk any further than that. And then you can carry your sofa, something to sit on, from your home to wherever it may be that you're going, but you cannot carry your bed. What's the difference? And y'all respond, but I'm telling you, that's what the Talmud, the Mishnah, that's what their traditions were. Their tradition says you can carry your sofa, but you can't carry your bed. Why did they get onto the man? Because he picked up his bed and walked with it. Brother Frank.
Even today, they have these strange rules. For example, on Saturday morning, I woke up in the hotel room to go down to eat. I was on the 5th or 6th floor, something like that. You go to the elevator, and the buttons don't work. Because you can't push a button on the elevator. I don't know what that's all.
Mm-hmm.
So the elevator stops whenever it pulls. So that when it gets to you, you can get on it and get off without pushing the button. I went down to where breakfast was, and obviously somebody cooked breakfast because it was food there. But each morning, I had gone to the coffee machine and pulled the lever down to get my coffee. That machine was not there. You can't pull a lever on the oven. But there was a picture of coffee, and you could take that picture and put it on. And so they have some strange rules that have existed and continue to exist.
Mm-hmm. And I think what Brother Frank gives a great explanation of is, I mean, here we're talking about 21st century example, but this is what we're dealing with in these controversies in the Sabbath day, is that they had built these safeguards because their ultimate goal, and I don't want us to slander them in the sacred, their ultimate goal was to keep themselves from breaking the Sabbath. They don't want to break the commandments of God. That's fine and good, right? Every one of us would agree with that. But when you have to erect your own man-made traditions to keep you from doing that, and then you honor those man-made traditions over the commandments, that's where the problem exists. And I think that's really what Jesus is doing here. And not only here, but how often did Jesus do a miracle, and how often was that miracle on the Sabbath as it is recorded? Several. And you think about that. Jesus doesn't shy away from this. Now, we know that Jesus did miracles daily. And at one point in time, as we've already studied, I mean, just droves of people are coming to him and to be healed from various things. But you think about Jesus healed this man in John chapter 5. He healed the man born blind in John chapter 9. He healed the crippled woman in Luke 13. He healed the man with dropsy in Luke chapter 14. He cast out an evil spirit in Mark chapter 1. Just occasion after occasion where Jesus does something and he heals on the Sabbath day. So what do you think the ultimate goal is when Jesus is doing this on the Sabbath day? All right, he's poking the bear. Because ultimately, what is he going to do through the miracle? The miracle, and then what he teaches is going to confirm what about himself? He's Lord of the Sabbath. That's the goal. That's what Jesus is trying to do with these various things.
He's making them think.
Mm-hmm.
He's not just simply giving them facts. He's challenging their thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I think even today people get in habits or traditions, whatever you want to call them, and they stop thinking, they stop examining the Scripture,
Mm-hmm.
and they just blindly follow whatever they've been told or taught. So Jews today, they blindly follow what they've been told or taught. They find no basis for it if they look in some of those doctrines.
Mm-hmm. Well, you become dependent upon the crutch.
Correct.
And forget how to walk correctly. Brother Foy, you were going to say something.
You mentioned a few minutes ago Genesis 2 in connection with keeping the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
When was the Sabbath put on the people?
Exodus 16 is the first example.
16. This mention of the Sabbath day in Genesis 2 is when the Lord God rested from creation.
Mhm. Well, and when you think about Genesis 2, I think Genesis 2 is tied to Matthew or John chapter 5, because what does Jesus say in 5 and verse 17? My Father is working until now, and so am I. The inference there is, even when God observed a Sabbath day, does the Sabbath mean a cessation of all things? Because what was God still doing on the seventh day? He's upholding the universe, and I'm glad he did. So I think that's the point that Jesus is making. From the very beginning, God has always been working. And just as he is working, so am I working. And of course, that's going to be the impetus for the major controversy that's coming up. Now, this next question, I'll just be honest, I didn't even answer. But, yes, sir.
Going back to, just talking about, I can't remember the verse or what, but I do remember reading or showing the hypocrisy of the king or the nation or whatever who he was talking to, is that, why are you working on the Sabbath to save your life? But then he comes back and says, is that wrong?
Mm-hmm.
When you're all on the Sabbath, taking life.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's kind of what his next point in Matthew 12 and Mark 3, with the withered man. I mean, they're waiting. This man is a plot in Mark chapter 3, where the man with the withered hand. So when we think about this question, what was Jesus' attitude toward the old law? This really wasn't answered for me in the text that we were supposed to be looking at, because the answer to this question is found in the Sermon on the Mount. What was Jesus' opinion of the old law? It's still binding. It's God's law. What did you say, Miss Patsy? He came to fulfill it. And I think that is so important. And Jesus emphasized every dot, every jot, nor tittle. Everything is going to be fulfilled. So what was Jesus' attitude toward the old law? It had to be fulfilled. He had a submissive and humble and obedient attitude toward that law. Brother Ron.
Yes, all that you said, but verse 46 says, for if you believe Moses, you believe me, for we wrote about him.
Mm-hmm.
So, in this context, he is pointing out that the law of Moses talked about him, and now he's here.
Mm-hmm.
And
And you think about what Jesus says, the law of Moses spoke about me. That's exactly what Paul said in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 25, that the law was what? It was a tutor that brought us to Christ. It is what brought us to Christ. That's exactly the correct answer. That's those two questions. All right. So this is the background, and I do appreciate how he kind of he put all of these controversies together, because certainly this is what's going to get that snowball to start rolling down the hill, in the sense that this is what the Pharisees are going to use against him at the end to finally have Jesus killed. So, looking at Matthew 12 and Mark 2 and Luke 6, let's explain the following. So, before we get to the explanations of the four things that were given, what are they accused of doing in Matthew chapter 12? All right, they're gathering grain on the Sabbath. So, the Pharisees are not accusing the disciples of stealing or being thefts, because was this allowed under the old law? If you become hungry and you're walking through a grain field, did God allow you to take what you needed to get through the rest of the day? Yes.
It was commanded to be left.
It was commanded to be left. Even the corners of it was commanded to be left for the stranger and the aliens. So God had all of this. So they're not breaking the law in that sense. Even so what they're saying is that when you got a handful of grain, wheat, barley, whatever it may have been, and you pull that seed out and put it in your mouth, you're threshing it. You're working. That's how minute they had become in their attention. Well, it wasn't that you broke the law and that you picked it, but then when you picked it and then you threshed it out in your hands and then ate it, that's work. You violated the old law there. So Jesus responds with 4 conversations, 4 arguments back toward them. The first is David in the showbread. What is Jesus' point there with David in the showbread?
They were hungry, they ate.
All right, they were hungry, they ate.
So he acknowledged that it was unlawful for him to have done that, but these Pharisees, they accepted that because of the David. They didn't have any problem with David doing that.
Mm.
No, it was unlawful. Jesus acknowledged it was unlawful.
All right, so I think that the major impetus, when I look at David in the showbread, and the way that I believe I see Jesus making this statement is, Jesus says David was wrong in eating the showbread. Because if you go back to Leviticus chapter 24, who was the showbread for? The priest and their sons, and that is it. But what was this new condition made up between Ahimelech and David? Well, as long as your men have not been with a woman lately, they can partake. Where does he get that? Or was it the priest just trying to figure out a way to justify what he was doing? I think the argument here is that you would not condemn David because you hold him in such high regard, but here you're condemning my men. And what does Jesus say about his disciples? Somebody read Matthew 12 and verse 7.
You had known what this means, that is our mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned guiltless.
What did Jesus consider his disciples at the end of verse 7? Guiltless. They were sinless. They had not violated anything. Jesus had not violated the Sabbath command by telling the man to pick up his pallet and walk. And Jesus most certainly would not have affiliated himself with his disciples at this moment if they had broken the Sabbath law. Now, when we think about David, and I know this is a much deeper conversation, and we can have that, and I'm willing to have that with you if you see it any different. But when I look at 1 Samuel chapter 21, I see David on the run, first off. Saul's coming after him. When he gets there, he's by himself, and he tells Ahimelech that he's on a mission sent by the king. That's a lie. That's a lie. David lied there. And then, even at the end of that chapter, what did David ask for? I need a weapon. Why do you need a weapon, David? Who's going to fight your battles for you, David? It's not a weapon, it's the Lord. And David, I believe, in 1 Samuel 21, is not dependent upon God as he ought to have been. And then I want to read you one comment by McGarvey. If Christians may violate law when its observance would involve hardship or suffering, then there is an end of suffering for the name of Christ and an end of self-denial. And I think he summarizes my idea of this very easily, very well. That David was making an addition and making it easier for himself when he should not have. All right, what about the second argument? The conflicts of duty. The easiest day of the week for the common Jew was what day? The Sabbath day.
Priests still had to do their work.
The busiest day of the week was what for the priest? The Sabbath day. Because on the Sabbath day, they still had to get up and they still had to sacrifice the lamb in the morning and had to sacrifice the lamb in the evening. Then they also had to make all the sabbatical sacrifices that were brought to them by individual Jews. They still had to do all of that. And when you think about these sacrifices, what a wonderful job that must have been, right? Because what do they have to do to these animals to prepare them for the altar? Slaughter them, cut them up, skin them, all of that wonderful stuff. And then on top of all of that, they had to replace the showbread. They had to make sure the incense is there burning in the temple and the tabernacle. There's multiple things. And then if a child had born 8 days prior, what are they doing on the 8th day? They're circumcised. It says, the duties of the priest did not cease on the Sabbath day. Would these Pharisees ever proclaim that the that the priests were working on the Sabbath? No. So again, Jesus is showing to them a conflict here in their line of thinking. The third is Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6. Brother Greg just read from that earlier, quoting that in verse 7. I desire compassion and not a sacrifice. What is it that God is really, what is it that Jesus is teaching us there?
Hosea 6:6.
All right. So what is Hosea teaching?
I desire mercy and not sacrifice.
Could it be that the form is meaningless? The form is vain if the heart is wrong.
I want your heart.
And I think that's the emphasis, is that the form, you can go through and you can go through all the checklists and you can make sure that, well, I was there and I sang the 2 songs, I was participant in the opening prayer, I sang the other song, I listened to the sermon, I sang the invitation song, I observed the Lord's Supper, I gave of my means, I was attentive during the closing song or closing prayer, I listened to my elders give me the announcements, and then I left the building. And you could do that, and you could do that every single week. But if your heart's not behind any of it, what does it mean? At the end of your days, if that's all you're doing is just checking the list, what is it for you? And I think that's what Jesus is getting at, is superficial rituals, burnt offerings, they can never replace faithful obedience. Just going through the motions versus actually giving your heart to.
Holy people today do the same thing the Jews were doing. They'll take the Bible and they'll lay their discipline or their manual or some kind of free book on top of the Bible.
Mhm.
That's their religion.
Mhm.
The Jews did the same thing. They had the scriptures,
Mhm.
sometimes called the law, sometimes called the law and the prophets, sometimes called the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. All that was inspired of God. But what did they lay on top of?
Mhm.
They laid the Talmud. The Talmud told the people how they were to do various things. And I think that's where this conflict comes in. These Jews are concerned about what the Talmud says, not what the scriptures say.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, when you think about Hosea 6 and verse 7, even there, as Adam transgressed the covenant, so are you. And the emphasis is that you're not obeying the law. You're not doing what I've called you to do. And then the final argument is that Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. What is it that he is saying here?
All of God's laws are made for man,
Mhm.
not man for laws. I got to read this one. The Sabbath day for man. It's day of rest, day of reflection, day of worship. God had all that in mind.
God understands that he gives the law to Israel because it is to their benefit. God always has man's good at the utmost in his direction and purpose. He wants the best for you. And as such, is working 7 days a week nonstop the best thing for you?
Have you ever worked 7 12s?
I've worked 6. I never worked 7.
I had to do that one summer, and I tell you what, I was young then.
It doesn't matter your age, does it? You can give the false claim, well, I can get used to it. But your body's going to run down. So that day of rest, you think about how God has this in his mind for the good of Israel.
Well, Jeff can tell you that there's a mandatory day off when you work that much, because people recognize that the fatigue sets in, you're more prone to make mistakes
Mhm.
when you work to that level, that number of hours. So there's a mandatory day off over a 14-day period.
Mhm.
Now, it is 2 weeks, but you can't work more than 14 days straight.
So it's interesting how we've adapted that type of mentality. Okay, we see that the longer somebody does this is the worse off for them. And you think, well, where did they get all of this from? Well, God's done this for us. God's the one who's organized all this. Now, while yet we may not have a Sabbath day, a day where we are completely, caused to rest and everything in the sense of Christians, But what are we working toward? Where is our Sabbath? Heaven. Somebody said it. Hebrews chapter 4. Thank you, Dawn. Miss Beth. But Hebrews chapter 4, we're all marching toward that day. That rest is where we're moving toward. All right. Well, what was the primary purpose or reason for Jesus' miracles? And I thought the best way to do this was just to go through each one of these. To end the world of disease. Is that the purpose of Jesus' miracles? Didn't work, did it? It didn't work, did it? All right, what about this one? To destroy the old law. He came to fulfill, not to destroy. So that doesn't work. To help men believe in Him. Yeah. What was John's gospel written? What was the very purpose of John's gospel? So that these signs have been written so that you may believe and have life in His name. That's the purpose. It's not just the primary. That is the reason for Jesus' miracles. To confront the Jews' false teaching. Sort of, kind of. In this particular context, if you keep it in the context of the verses that we're looking at, yes, Jesus used His miracles to provoke them. But that's not a primary reason. All right, this next one. Why did Jesus not heal all of the sick and crippled around the pool of Bethesda? I thought this was an interesting question. He did not have the time. Did He have to have time? What did Jesus do with the nobleman's son in John chapter 4? Go your way and he's healed. He didn't even have to go there, did He? Jesus didn't even have to go to the pool of Bethesda. So it's not that He didn't have time, all right? Many lack the faith necessary to be healed. Why is that false? Because this guy, the individual that was healed, had no faith. Yeah, he's concerned about getting in the water. Jesus doesn't even get him in the water. Doesn't have to get him in the water. So that's all right. So that's not. He feared the Jews would retaliate. Well, He pokes the bear. But again, what did He say to His disciples in John chapter 15? If the world hates you, know first what? It hated me. It hated me first. I don't think that, and I think D, it was not about physical healing. His mission was not about physical healing because His mission was about what? The Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which is lost. He has come to remedy the greater condition of man's soul, and that is the sins that we have unfortunately committed.
Well, He did fear the Jews would retaliate. I think that's why He passed unnoticed.
Yes.
Out of the area.
Well, and there in John's gospel and other places, he passes through their midst because what is not yet? It's not time. It's not my hour is another thing that we see. All right. All right, these next two questions were a little, I mean, it's hard not to see the overlap here, but in what sense was Jesus the Son of God? In every sense. 100%, right? He's 100%. That's the very point of John chapter 1 in that prologue, is that John is presenting to us the mountain of evidence that Jesus was fully God incarnate. He is fully God and deity in human form. And that you look specifically at John chapter 1 and verse 18 is the one that oftentimes we look at verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw His glory. Glory is the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. But verse 18, no one has seen God at any time, the only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father. He has explained Him. The very purpose of Jesus coming as the Son of God, He came to do what? This is more of like what Brother Matt's been teaching on Wednesday evenings, but He came to reveal God. He is the explanation of God.
Cody, you could argue that the Old Testament taught children to be subject to their parents. Jesus was subject to God
Absolutely. So, all right, Brother Floyd brings up, let's go to John chapter 5 and look at those two verses. So Brother Floyd said the old law taught that the sons and daughters are to what? The fifth commandment, right? Honor your father and your mother. Well, Luke chapter 2 and verse 52, Jesus did what? He obeyed his parents, and he grew in wisdom and stature in favor among all men and even God. But here in John chapter 5, now we begin to get, because Jesus says something in verse 17, as the Father is working, I am working. The Jews understood what Jesus is saying. He was making himself what? Equal with God. So when they hear Son of God, they hear Jesus is making himself equal. Well, what does he say in verse 19? The Son can do what? Nothing of himself. And he has to see the Father doing it. For whatever the Father does, these things the Son also does in like manner. He's going to repeat that again in verse 30. I can do nothing on my own initiative. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of him who sent me. You see this idea, this coming to fruition here, that Jesus he has come to reveal, to explain the Father. And while Jesus is even on earth, and while Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Jesus still plays what role in relation to the Father? He's submissive to the Father. He's the servant of the Father. I think that's a great term too. He's the servant of the Father. I came to do my Father's will. Now, there in John chapter 5, let's stay here for just a moment, because I think verse 19 down to verse 30 really are bookends, because it's what happens in between. Because Jesus was willing to honor the Father by his humble and faithful obedience, the Father does what for the Son? All right, he gives him all authority. He commits all judgment to him. He gives him the right to have life. He is the giver of life. And the third is that just as the Father would be exalted and be set apart, so is the Son going to be exalted and set apart. But why does God give that to the Son? Because the Son was obedient to the Father, submissive to the Father. So those are the things that are all working together. And that's how I answered that question, is that I took that back to John chapter 5. Well, in what sense is Jesus the Son of Man? 100%. Again, it's how do you do that? I've often heard that, trying to distinguish these two is like trying to remove the egg white from the yolk. You're just not going to be successful. You're always going to get a little yolk, or you're always going to get a little bit less egg white. You just can't do the two, because they're inseparable at times. But when you think about Jesus as the Son of Man, how many times, the author gave you this in the material, how many times was Jesus mentioned as the Son of Man in the Gospels? Lots of times. 88 to be precise. He says Jesus often referred to himself as the Son of Man over 30 times in Matthew, 15 times in Mark, 25 times in Luke, 12 times in John. And it is frequently found in the Old Testament in the book of Psalms, Daniel, and Ezekiel. Why then would the Son of Man be used in the Gospels? Because when you look at Daniel chapter 7 and verses 13 and 14, who came before the Ancient of Days? One is the appearance of the Son of Man. What did Luke do in his genealogy that sets him apart from Matthew's genealogy? Luke took Jesus in the genealogy all the way back to who? Adam. Why does Luke do that? Luke's writing to a Greek Gentile audience, and what he wants to present and what he wants to impact his readers with is that Jesus was human. That he was entirely flesh and blood, just as we are. And I think that's why his genealogy goes back to that. That's the emphasis that I see with the Son of Man. Any other thoughts on those two questions? Is the question itself, in what sense was Jesus? Because it really should be is instead of was, because it's not a past tense, it's a present reality. All right. List 4 circumstances that confirm the deity of Christ. I went back to John chapter 5 for my answer.
4 witnesses.
All right, the 4 witnesses. That's what so the healing of any of the miracles could absolutely be used to confirm the deity of Christ. But I really thought that this was a better question to be answered from John chapter 5. Because remember, John chapter 5, 19 through 30 seems to be a bookend. Verses 31 through the end of the chapter is really a summarized argument of Jesus. So there's 4 witnesses that Jesus gives at the end of John chapter 4.
There's
5.
actually 5.
5.
But he said the first one is himself, so somebody's going to want proof.
All right, so I can attest for myself, but you're not going to want that because the old law says you need what? You need witnesses. And how many? You need 2 to 3 witnesses. So Jesus begins to give witnesses. So what's the first witness that Jesus gives? John the Baptist. Because what had John been saying all along? I'm the forerunner. It's not me. I'm not the Christ. I'm not the Messiah. There is one who's coming after me. And then, how did John signify that Jesus was, behold, the Lamb of God who's come to take away the sins of the world? John came doing what? Baptizing. And through that baptism, when Jesus came out of the waters of the Jordan, what descended upon him? And who spoke? God. And then even later in John chapter 3, when his disciples say, Jesus and his disciples, they're baptizing more, what did John say? He must increase, I must decrease. This is what it's always been. So John's the first bit of evidence. All right, who's another? Or what is another source? All right, the works, the signs themselves. The miracles that Jesus performed. No one could deny them. Nicodemus came to Jesus. Why?
Nobody can do what you're doing except to be from God.
No one can do these works unless they are sent by God. The works attest. The works verify and confirm. Third, the Father. Again, the Father spoke at his baptism. The Father was present there and said, behold, this is my Son in whom I am well pleased. The Father is going to speak at the Mount of Transfiguration. The Father is going to speak in John chapter 12 and verse 28. I have both glorified him and will glorify it again. And I believe the Father is going to speak loudly in the resurrection of the Son, because that's going to be the ultimate sign of Jesus being the Son of God. And then finally, what is the 4th witness? The Scriptures. The Scriptures. In the parable, however y'all want to phrase it, rich man and Lazarus. Rich man asked Abraham to do what? Go back and warn his brothers. And what did Abraham respond? They have Moses and the prophets. If they're not willing to adhere and listen and believe and obey the word, they're not going to believe somebody who's been resurrected from the dead. And you think about the emphasis that Jesus places upon Scriptures, not just here in John chapter 5, but even at the tail end of his ministry. In John chapter 12, what does he say about the Scriptures? What's going to judge you in the end? The words which I have spoken. And I think here we see that connection all the way through. All right. Any other comments, questions, observations on our class this morning?
Quick question about the pool test. Did you say that it wasn't causing disturbance?
I said an explanation might possibly be, not that it was an angel, but that they would open the upper pool, and when they were refilling the lower pool, that the stirring of the water was just that.
Because my translation specifically says an actual catching stir.
Yes.
That's what we.
Well, and at the end of verse 3, verse 4, many of your translations, if you'll read the footnote, that's not going to be found in your earliest translations or earliest Greek manuscripts and different things like that. Again, we can do a deep dive in some of those things, and we might need to talk about those in future day. Any other comments, observations? I appreciate so much your kind attention. I hope the study has been beneficial. I enjoyed it very much this morning. Thank you.